Hey everyone, welcome back to Wicked Deeds. We're your hosts. I'm Brittany.
And I'm John.
And today, we'll be discussing a case where a 15-year-old Orthodox Jew was brutally murdered in his sleep. Due to the murder taking place on the Sabbath, authorities would soon find themselves fighting an uphill battle when reaching out to the community for assistance. The rules and laws upheld by their faith severely limited their ability to speak on the matter. Decades later, with the young boy's killer still on the loose, details surrounding his death are becoming clearer. And hopefully, if the right people finally come forward, this murderer can face the consequences of their actions 36 years later. Today's case is about the murder of Chaim Weiss. Hayam Weiss was a 15-year-old Orthodox Jewish boy who was just about to turn 16 in October of 1986. His parents were Anton and Pessi Weiss, and at the time, Anton was working in the wholesale jewelry industry in Manhattan. Hayam lived with them and two siblings, one brother who was 11 years old, and a sister who was 7, and they all lived on Walcott Street in Staten Island, New York. However, Hayam didn't live at home full-time anymore as he was attending school at a yeshiva on Long Island. At the time our story begins, Hayam was a junior, so he'd been going to the school for a little over 2 years at this point. The yeshiva was called the Masivta of Long Island, but also had been known as the Torah High School of Long Island as well. And before we move forward, I do just want to preface the next part of, the background of this case with an apology if I get anything wrong regarding Orthodox Judaism. I want to go over a few pieces of information about it with you guys, our listeners, as well as John, as I'm sure he's not super well-versed in the religion either. I definitely don't know all that there is to know. There's a lot of information out there, a lot of different sources on the topic, but I did my best to get the basics under my belt. But if I get anything wrong, I would really appreciate any corrections from our listeners. And I also feel like I might get some pronunciations wrong too, but I did listen to a bunch of videos to try and get everything right or as best as I can. So with that, I want to go over a couple definitions in regards to some of the terminology that we're going to be using and discussing throughout this episode. Let's first define Orthodox Judaism. According to Britannica.com, Orthodox Judaism is, quote, the religion of those Jews who adhere most strictly to traditional beliefs and practices, end quote. And according to MyJewishLearning.com, quote, Orthodox Judaism is the most religiously stringent of the three main streams of American Judaism, end quote. The particular page that I was on this My Jewish Learning website also gave a few bullet points regarding some of the beliefs of Orthodox Jews, and I wanted to review those to kind of put things into perspective for you. Quote, its adherents believe the Torah was given to the Jewish people in a mass revelation at Mount Sinai, and that the rabbinical tradition, known as the oral law, is a faithful elucidation of divine rules for Jewish living that are obligatory upon all Jews today. It is most prominently distinguished from more liberal approaches to Jewish practice by its adherence to gender-segregated prayer and its rejection of traveling on the Shabbat. Orthodox Judaism is more resistant than its liberal counterparts to the idea that biblical mandates can change in response to changing social circumstances. Its adherents tend to live in concentrated geographic areas. Nearly 4 out of 5 American Orthodox Jews live in the northeastern United States, end quote. Also, we're going to refer to the Shabbat, or Sabbath, quite a bit, which is the day of rest in Judaism. But the day of the week is actually Saturday, not Sunday like in Christianity or Catholicism. And lastly, one more term that I wanted to define before we move forward in the story is what a yeshiva is. According to JewishVirtualLibrary.org, a yeshiva, quote, refers to institutes of Talmudic learning, end quote. And Talmudic learning refers to the Talmud, which, according to MyJewishLearning.com, quote, is the generic term for the documents that comment and expand upon the Mishnah, repeating, the first work of rabbinic law, end quote. That was a lot.
Yes.
I just wanted you to have some semblance of a basis of understanding before we kind of move into all of this. So if I'm giving you this terminology and all these words, that it's what does all of this even mean? At least you kind of have like a couple definitions under your belt.
Sure. So like the yeshiva is the school that they're going to.
Mm-hmm.
Sabbath is Saturday for them, or Shabbat.
Yep.
And then for like Orthodox Judaism as a whole, very strict, very religious.
Yes, absolutely.
To put it in layman's terms, essentially.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so now that you have a tiny bit of information on Orthodox Judaism, let's get back to the Masivta of Long Island, where Hayam was enrolled. While there, students studied the Talmud, and attendees actually came from all over the globe to attend this school, not just New York. Based on my research, I've also come to the conclusion that the yeshiva was an all-boys school, and during the 1986 school year, there were approximately 120 students enrolled. Tuition for the yeshiva back in 1986, according to the school's rabbi at the time, was roughly $6,000 a year, which, if you increase that to today's pricing based on inflation, would amount to roughly $16,221.41.
It's an expensive school to be paying to go to.
Versus public school.
And it's just like, it's high school.
Yeah, exactly. So. Well, I mean, we're going to get into what this really is. It's not just high school. So
it's what you'd be going to in public school if you were going there. It's you're of high school age.
Yeah,
but it seems more, I'm going to guess that it's more like getting you ready for your position in the faith going forward.
Yeah, a lot of students were studying to become rabbis.
Right.
That was like the big thing.
That's what I would think. It's like, yes, you're going to school there, but because your whole life revolves around the religion, it's probably getting you ready for whatever position or whatever path you're going to take in that religion later on as you grow up.
Yeah, well, so there's an article written in Newsday that described the stringency of the school day and honestly the entire school year, and I feel like it really put things into perspective for me, and I thought it was really interesting to learn about, so I wanted to read it for you. The article stated, quote, "Life for a Masivta student is rigorous. The day begins at 7:30 with an hour-long session of prayer. There's a 20-minute breakfast, and then 6 hours of Jewish teaching. Then, from 3:30 to 6:30, the students take secular courses leading to a New York State Regents diploma. In the evening, they gather again in the study hall for private study groups. The day ends with their third prayer session. The school year lasts 11 months, including a 6-week summer camp in the Catskills, during which the academic schedule is only slightly less strict," end quote.
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective of the people attending this, it's like, you're not going to school and then having summer vacation. This is like your life. It seems like your entire life revolves around your religion and your faith and how you're going to live a life that's fulfilling what's required of you within that religion.
And within that community, too, like just the Orthodox community within New York or Long Island. And, I mean, you can probably tell these kids were very disciplined. And Hayam was obviously very disciplined as well. But a friend of his did describe him for Newsday as, quote, "one of the best liked, popular, and smartest students at the school," end quote. So now's about the time where we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the story. So on the afternoon of Friday, October 31st, 1986, and yes, if you caught that, that's Halloween, Chaim Weiss left his afternoon class with his buddies, and if you're thinking about the quote I just read for you regarding how the day was structured, he was going to be attending evening services with said friends. After those services had ended, he returned to his dorm building and probably dorm room, but the dorm building itself was located a few blocks over from the school on 63 East Beach Street. There were 3 dorm buildings in total, and roughly 40 students lived in each building. The thing that's very interesting, though, is the fact that Hayam had his own private room, being one of only 2 students who didn't have to have a roommate. When I first read that tidbit of information, I was definitely curious regarding why he may have been one of the lucky ones to end up without a roommate. At first I thought, could there have been maybe special treatment, or could you pay more money to be able to, have a roommate-free dorm room? But later on, as I continued my research, it seems as though, at least based on what the rabbi said at the time, that Hayam had been randomly chosen to have his own private room.
Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed that either. I would have thought that it would have had something to do with his family or maybe his projected position.
Yeah, like if he was going to be...
Like he's Percy, he's the head boy of the school at the time, or his classmates or something like that. But
yeah, that was more along the lines of what I thought. Like as I was researching this, I'm like, oh, so I guess it's like, do they just like put all the names in a hat and then they just like picked his name out and he was one of the lucky ones? That's kind of what it seemed like. So That's just what I was thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless of that, back to what was going on Halloween night after Hayam had finished his evening services. He supposedly went back up to his dorm room and was later seen actually reading or studying in the hallway around 1 a.m. So now this would technically be considered November 1st at this point in the night. But again, yet another thing that I was a little confused about because of my lack of knowledge on Orthodox Judaism was why Hayam would be reading or studying in the hallway rather than in his own room that late at night. Well, according to Jewish practices, it had something to do with the fact that you shouldn't have lights on the Sabbath. And I did hear this initially when I watched the Unsolved Mysteries episode on this case, but it was kind of unclear why he wouldn't have just been reading in his room, so I did a little digging. According to myjewishlearning.com, the operation of electrical devices on the Jewish Sabbath is categorically prohibited by Orthodox Jewish authorities. Orthodox and other traditionally observant Jews therefore do not use lights or electrical appliances on the Sabbath. However, there is no prohibition on using a light that was turned on before the Sabbath began, end quote.
Okay, I was assuming that there was going to be like a candlelit hallway or something.
Well, it was a lit hallway, and the light must have already been on in the hallway.
Right, they must leave it on all the time.
Yeah.
So
that was my guess on that one. Like, if his light was off in his room and he wanted to read or he wanted to study, he knew that these were, the Sabbath laws, and he needed to go out to the hallway to do that because he couldn't put the light on.
Mm-hmm. When you had first said that he's reading out in the hallway, I was kind of thinking, oh, maybe he's doing that because he doesn't have a roommate and he likes to see other people.
Oh, that's a good point too. Who knows? But
yeah,
it was just one of the things that like popped into my head.
Yeah, because I would have thought back to the candlelight thing. I'm sure he could have lit a candle or a kerosene lantern or something like that in his room and read in there. But to read out in the hallway, it's more of a public area. Maybe he'd see some of his buddies.
Yeah.
And he said that he was one of the most well-liked people, so that's what I thought. But interesting to hear that if the light has been left on since before the Sabbath,
that it's okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
all very interesting. Like things that I totally learned so much when I was researching this case.
So you can't use it. Like you can't flip the switch.
Yeah.
But if it was turned on Friday night, you're good to go.
Exactly. All right. So moving right along. The following morning, or technically I guess at this point the same morning, but Saturday, November 1st, the students had Sabbath services, but weirdly enough, Hayam didn't show up. So his dorm advisor, as he was called, which really kind of just sounds like an RA or resident assistant in college, but he went to Hayam's room to check on him and see why he didn't show up. But when he got to the room, he found that Hayam had been murdered. According to the Unsolved Mysteries episode on this case, Detective Don Daly was one of the first officers on the scene when the call came in about Hayam's murder. It was originally believed by authorities and the public that Hayam had been bludgeoned to death. But as detectives began working the case, some different information was brought to light. First of all, it was assumed that Hayam had been killed on Saturday, the Sabbath, November 1st, because he had been seen around 1 a.m. still alive. His exact time of death was not revealed at first, but things seemed to be a little bit confusing there and kind of all over the place in the beginning, but I will say it is revealed later that he was killed sometime after 1:20 a.m., which, I mean, that makes sense just knowing that he was seen in the hallway around 1 a.m.
Do we know who's seen by?
No.
Okay.
I assume just witnesses, whether it be students or faculty walking around the dorm buildings, maybe the RA, I'm not entirely sure. But at first, like I just mentioned, it was believed that Hayam had been bludgeoned to death, but that's not the final ruling on that. Come to find out, Hayam had in fact been stabbed in the face, head, and neck. Once this piece of information came out, it was rumored that the murder weapon could have been an axe. However, within a day or so of the murder, it was reported that a knife had actually been found. Initially, things like this statement came out. Quote, Edwards declined to describe the knife or to say exactly where it was found. He said it had no blood on it, end quote. However, of course, as time goes on, it's discovered that the knife was actually located either outside the dorm building or maybe even outside his dorm room. It's a little unclear if it was nearby to where his room, like the door to his room, or the window from the outside of the building was, but either way, it was found somewhat near the scene. Now, said knife that was found was later described in Newsday, and it explained both what the knife looked like and where it was found. The article stated a, quote, large-handled, heavy-duty knife with a 6-inch blade was found outside the dormitory room and was being examined by forensic specialists to try to match any blood stains or other evidence with the blood of the dead student, end quote. And just a few days later, the ME determined for sure that the cause of death was from stab wounds to Hayam's face, head, and neck, and that he, quote, suffered a laceration of the brain, end quote.
A laceration of the brain?
Correct.
So they stabbed through his skull?
Yes. So a few days after Hayam had been killed, his autopsy was completed, and the ME had more specific information now about Hayam's injuries. For starters, the ME described the murder as a, quote, frenzy-type killing. Now, Hayam's position in his bed when he was killed was also further clarified. He was in fact murdered while he was asleep in his bed, and the ME explained that he was, quote, lying on his left side when he was killed by the first of several blows to the right side of his head and neck, end quote. The first hit, as mentioned in that statement from the ME, was to Hayam's right temple, and that was the stab wound that penetrated his brain, which was said to have killed him immediately. After that, Hayam was hit again in the right temple, then a third time on the right side of his face, and then the fourth and final stab wound was in his neck. The ME also stated that a large knife could have potentially been the murder weapon, but that was not confirmed definitively. He did say that the wounds to Hayam's temple and face, quote, indicated that a hatchet-type weapon may have been used, end quote. Now, a couple other things to note are that there was no indication of a sexual assault and that authorities believed pretty early on that Hayam was specifically targeted, that this was not just a random attack. They also didn't really have a real motive in mind at this point, but they had ruled out the idea of a robbery, as Hayam had some expensive belongings on him when he was killed. And lastly, it was stated that none of the students in the building heard anything at all that night, which already seems a little weird, but we're going to get into that a little bit more later.
Well, if he was killed on the first strike, I could understand people not hearing anything.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little confused on, a stab wound versus a hack wound.
Mm-hmm.
How can you say, a knife versus a hatchet?
Mm-hmm.
You would assume that if it was a hatchet, that kind of injury would be more misconstrued as a bludgeoning.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Because of the total surface area of like a hatchet blade versus the point of a knife.
Yeah.
Unless they were talking about like a 6-inch meat cleaver style knife.
Maybe, but it's just weird that they found a large 6-inch blade knife nearby. So if the ME's saying like, oh, it could have been that, and then they find one, that's weird.
Yeah, that's weird. When thinking about the knife, though, I think, a 6-inch heavy-handled knife.
Mm-hmm.
I think of like a buck knife, like a hunting knife type thing.
Yeah.
And if you're stabbing somebody with that, I don't think that wound is going to look at all like a hatchet.
Could you essentially
like you're not going to
stab and then like hit with a handle after the fact?
I mean, you're saying that 6-inch blade is going all the way through his temple.
Yeah.
I doubt it's going to go that deep. I don't know. I'm interested to hear more. I would say that if they thought this was a bludgeoning, I don't think the knife is the murder weapon.
Okay.
At this point, anyway.
Well, initially they thought it was a bludgeoning. Then it was confirmed that it was a stabbing.
But the ME is also saying that it could have been a hatchet weapon.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of confusion, it seems, in regards to like what was initially reported, what was reported a few days later, what's reported years later. I don't know if things have evolved over time, but that's what the ME had put out, at least to the public, back in 86.
Mm-hmm. I think that the information the ME is giving out is conflicting because a hatchet wound is not going to be a stab wound.
Makes sense. I totally agree with you. So as authorities began their investigation to find out who killed Chaim Weiss, they ran into some issues from the very start. The first and biggest issue, which honestly I hate to call it an issue, but it's the fact that Chaim's murder took place on the Sabbath. Remember, this is a day of rest for Orthodox Jews. They would not even use electricity. And there's a lot more that goes into that, but just based on what I read on myjewishlearning.com, it's a day of rest where you really can't engage in any sort of labor. The website goes into a lot of specifics in terms of like what can and cannot be done on the Sabbath. So if you're interested in knowing more, I do suggest taking a look at that. But Basically, it became difficult for investigators because there were rules that needed to be followed by the Orthodox Jewish community, and obviously that made it a little bit tougher to work around.
So when they find out that this kid's murdered and they're going around asking people, they're probably going to hit a wall where they're like, it's the Sabbath. We're not answering any questions. We're not helping with the investigation.
Yeah, and there was one specific thing that was reported regarding the fact that you're not supposed to drive on the Sabbath. So like if authorities wanted anyone to come down and give statements at the station, that wasn't going to happen. So they kind of had to do a switcheroo, and they all went to the Masivta of Long Island, and they tried to speak to as many people as they could because they couldn't get anyone to come to them. They had to go to the school. But I will say the wildest thing to me has to do with the fact that Hayam's parents apparently weren't even notified of his murder like that day because of the Sabbath laws.
Right, you can't use the phone.
You can't do a lot of things, and then...
Can't use the phone, can't drive.
Exactly. And then on top of that, like you just said, no one wanted to talk to police either because of other Sabbath laws, which, again, is something that we will dive into a little bit more later on. But I do want to focus a little bit on what authorities were looking into and thinking at this point in their investigation. So let's start in terms of the scene and kind of what things looked like in and around the dorm building. There were some interesting nuggets of information reported on regarding this. First of all, in terms of the accessibility to the building, it being a dorm for high school-age students, there was a lock on the front and there was a special combination code needed to get in. However, there was another access point, a back door that was supposed to be kept locked, and lastly, a fire escape that I guess you could get to the third floor from. And where was Hayam's dorm? The third floor. Now, it was reported that whoever did this would have had to have known where Hayam's room was located to be able to find him specifically. Because remember, authorities did believe he was targeted. But the fire escape didn't go directly into Hayam's room, but it was close enough that it could have potentially been a way that the killer got in. It's also reported in Newsday that the fire escape could only be opened from the inside. So then that prompted a few questions to pop into my head while I was researching. First, was there more than one person involved? Second, did Hayam plan to meet someone and he let them in himself at the fire escape? Third, was someone let in from the outside by another person entirely that lived in that dorm building, and that person was like an accomplice almost that lived there and helped the other person get in? Or four, and probably the most obvious, was it just someone living in the same building that was already in there and then knew where Hayam's room was and then committed the murder, bypassing the need to even get into the building from all these other potential entrances?
I'm not sure. I think I need more information to really come to a conclusion on that, or to kind of point me in one direction or another. When you said that the fire escape could only be opened from the inside, I assumed somebody else being involved, or Hayam being the one that let somebody in, assuming that it wasn't somebody that was already in the building.
But it could really be any of those. Regardless of all these questions and what the potential answer might be, it's reported that there were no signs of forced entry into the dorm building in general, and more specifically, no forced entry into Hayam's room.
Which was locked? Or are they usually locked?
The front door had a combination code that was locked. The back door, I feel like it's a little wishy-washy, I'm not entirely sure. And then the fire escape, really you could get in as long as someone opened it from the inside for you. So.
I mean his personal dorm room.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if there were locks. I would assume not, because it seems like you could just get in very easily to each person's room, just based on what I've read.
Okay.
Regardless of all of this, authorities weren't ruling out the possibility that someone was let in or that a door may have just been accidentally left open or left unlocked. So they weren't ruling out really anything at this point. Now, in terms of the murder weapon, I had mentioned earlier that a knife had been found, but as of today, it really doesn't seem like the murder weapon itself was found, unless, during authorities' additional searches of the local area, sewers nearby, maybe something was found. But if it was, it certainly was never reported on.
So it's probably not that knife.
Probably not that knife. It was never reported as definitively not this knife, but just kind of piecing together what was stated, it doesn't seem like it was.
Right. I mean, they said that they have this knife that they found in the area. But if they never came forward and said that that's the murder weapon.
Exactly.
And the ME was like, oh, it could have been a hatchet type weapon. Leads you to believe that that's not it.
Yeah, that's what I took it as. So earlier, we had talked a little bit about motive, but as previously mentioned, there wasn't really one in mind for authorities yet. But that didn't mean that the public wouldn't have different thoughts on the matter. For starters, students were terrified at this point, as were their parents, and rightly so. The dorm building where Hayam was killed had been closed indefinitely, and students had to stay elsewhere. Not only that, some kids didn't even return to the school because of how worried both they and their parents were. One of the rabbis at the time, Rabbi Lezin, talked about how the student body as well as the faculty were feeling. Newsday reported that Rabbi Lezin stated, quote, "They're frightened and they're worried. They don't know how to react. I don't know how to react," end quote. But basically what I'm trying to get at by telling you all of this is something maybe you might have already guessed or have in your mind so far. It's the fact that there were rumors swirling. And those rumors were that this murder was a hate crime based in anti-Semitism.
Interesting. I hadn't gone that way yet just because it's like such a hard place to get into. What are the odds that this person that's targeting Jews gets in there, gets out, makes no noise? I understand how the community sees it.
Yeah.
I could be way off base here, but I'm thinking, did somebody in that community know that Hayam was violating particular laws of the religion? I was thinking maybe he's targeted that way.
Oh, because he just did something he shouldn't have and someone was upset about it? Or...
Right. I was thinking more that way just because it's like nobody heard anything. There's no electricity on in the building at that time. Like
outside of what was left on, yeah.
Right. It's probably like you hear a pin drop type thing.
Yep.
So obviously there was no struggle during the murder, but...
But also you have to think, like we talked about this in Stacey Burns, that is a very angry person that's attacking him like this.
Right.
Like, to stab somebody in the face, you have to be very angry with them.
Yes, I agree. I don't think I necessarily put it in the same category as Stacey Burns because of the number of times that she was stabbed.
Yeah.
This was like 1, 2, 3, 4. I think that the reason he was probably stabbed in the face is because they were going for the head because they were attempting to kill as fast as possible.
True, to avoid any sort of struggle or noise or something like that. I guess I can see what you're saying there, yeah. All right, so let's back up a little bit now to Halloween night, so the night before Hayam was killed, and this might give you a little bit of reasoning why the public might have believed that this could have been anti-Semitism. So on Halloween night, I guess there were some students that were targeted, and they had eggs thrown at them and were also being chased by kids that didn't go to the yeshiva. So, I mean, that's certainly concerning. And I guess it was such a big deal that students were even escorted to their dorms by the Long Beach Auxiliary Police just in case there were further attacks on students throughout the night. And now, that same night, a student had been murdered.
I understand. I see the connection. But you're also having, kids targeted by other kids when they're out on Halloween night. That's not the same as breaking into the yeshiva, stealthily getting to one student in particular's room and carrying out like an execution-style murder.
Yes, I think it's just when you see the two things happening on the same night to say, like, all right, we know that these were kids that didn't attend the yeshiva. So if it's a non-Jewish person attacking a Jewish person, that might just be the first thought that comes to mind.
Right, and you know that it's a thing where Orthodox Jews get targeted and harassed just because of the way they dress and the way they have their hair and their hats and everything. So people are assholes.
It's interesting you say that. Yeah, it's really interesting you say that because there were a couple things reported regarding the fact that like some people in the community that weren't a part of the Orthodox community had a problem with the way they looked and the way they dressed and all these things. And I'm like, honestly, why the fuck do you care? Like, it's their community. It's what they're doing. Like, you're living near or within it and just let them be.
Right.
So, I mean, if the community is saying, like, there are people that dislike the yeshiva and the people who are going to the yeshiva, then I could see, like, maybe now, okay, there was this attack on Halloween night. Now there's this brutal murder the next morning. I can see how people would put two and two together and say, there's definitely a potential here for anti-Semitism.
Yeah, especially when you're a part of that group.
Yeah, exactly. So it did seem as though things were going to be taken very seriously, at least on the school's part at first, kind of just based on early reporting, but they were considering hiring armed guards due to the violence that had taken place. However, by November 4th, 1986, just 3 days after Hayam's body had been found, Rabbi Lezin made the decision to decline allowing the Jewish militant group to assist in protecting the school. According to the Daily News, quote, he did not view the slaying of Chaim Weiss as an anti-Semitic attack and did not want the group's help, end quote. Another comment from the rabbi reported in the Daily News regarding said Jewish militant group was, quote, we don't want them and they are not coming, end quote.
Interesting.
The literal note I had written down when I was researching this case was, that's suspicious. Why wouldn't you want to protect the other students, honestly, just as a precaution? At the end of the day, like, even if it's not anti-Semitism, protection is protection.
Yeah, I see that to an extent. I think that if the yeshiva is like a holy place, a holy school, not wanting a militant group on the premises could be one reason why they don't want them there.
Yeah, I mean, I get that, but even just having them around, like outside of the property?
I guess. I don't know. And then I think, why did this rabbi think, similar to me, that this is not an anti-Semitic murder or attack? Does he know something we don't? Is he weirdly involved somehow?
Yeah, I don't know. It was all like very sus.
Does he know what happened?
Who knows?
So
we'll keep going.
Yep.
Now, there were quite a few articles that reported on what was going on at the time with this militant group and the school. And honestly, it seems, at least to me, that there might have been like some weird things going on behind closed doors, and the school and the locals were acting kind of weird. And I was like, what is going on here? Like, I could not really piece anything together, and it wasn't really discussed at this point. But I just want to kind of lay the groundwork to say, like, I feel like there was some sketchy stuff going on. But moving back to the militant group, they said that they were still going to patrol the area. And on top of that, the Nassau County PD as well as Long Beach PD did increase their patrols in the area as well to hopefully thwart any future attacks. So you've got this militant group outside the school now, even though they're like, not technically wanted, and it's like, too bad we're going to be here. Then you have the Nassau County PD, then you have the Long Beach PD. So kind of regardless of what the rabbi said or wanted, like, he's still got extra patrols around.
Right, so the rabbi is trying to keep control over the yeshiva.
Yep.
But the militant group is like, no, this is our community. We still want to protect it.
These are our kids, is probably what they're thinking.
Right, so they're still kind of hanging around the area. And then, of course, when a murder happens and there's a possible connection to it being a hate crime or something similar, police in the area are also going to keep, closer eye on that general area.
Yeah, exactly. Even though some people believed that Hayam's murder could have been anti-Semitism driven, authorities stated that they'd pretty much completely ruled out that idea, that was the motive. Authorities were looking into the idea, though, that a faculty member or even a student could have been responsible. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying before about, like, what if they lived in that particular dorm? You're not going to worry about signs of forced entry, because if they're in that dorm building, you're not going to have that.
Right.
So,
which is more along the lines of me thinking that maybe Hayam had been doing something that he wasn't supposed to, and then he was targeted because of that, targeted by somebody inside the building.
Yep.
The people inside the building would know, like, what was the RA person again?
Dorm advisor.
The dorm advisor, they would probably have an idea of when the dorm advisor would make their rounds.
Yep.
They knew that, it was going to be all quiet at the time. They knew the inner goings of it. Makes more sense that nobody heard anything or nobody saw anything versus some outside entity getting into the building somehow, however they ended up doing it.
Yeah.
Getting up to the third floor, getting to Hayam's bedroom and killing him and getting out.
Yeah.
Just seems more far-fetched.
I agree, yeah. Well, at this point, the rabbi, again, this is Rabbi Lezin that we're talking about, he was positive that there was no way a student could have done this. But with him saying that, then I was like, okay, but Rabbi Lezin, what about the faculty?
Right.
Could it have been a faculty member? Like, why would he just say, oh, there's no way a student could have done this? But did he think that, like, someone that worked at his yeshiva could be responsible?
Or maybe he knows who is responsible?
Yeah, I don't know. I just thought it was very weird.
I mean, it goes with all religions. There are some shady things that are always done within them and kept quiet within a specific group of people that may be in, a higher authority position. So I would imagine that there aren't many things that happen in the yeshiva that the rabbi or his close people don't know about.
I agree. But either way, Authorities continued to interview students and faculty members to try and get a picture of what life was like at the yeshiva on a daily basis, and more so to, I think, like, find flaws in what took place that day to see if maybe something different than normal took place or, something along those lines. Detective Sergeant Robert Edwards told Newsday, quote, "Today, we're after the real background as to what goes on in the school," he said, including minor jealousies and friendships, end quote. So the students were still being talked to by investigators, and some were even given polygraph tests as well. But even with their cooperation with the authorities, they weren't going to give that same cooperation to reporters or, honestly, even that Jewish militant group that was trying to help. You see, reporters were obviously trying to get info, and they wanted to talk to students at the school, maybe if they were friends with Hayam or if they, maybe lived nearby to his dorm room if theirs was close. But I think they just wanted their privacy, and they didn't want to talk to anyone, and I totally don't fault them for that. But not only that, students were also supposedly seen yelling at the militant group that had come to help, because even though the rabbi didn't want them there, the group told Newsday that they were still going to patrol, and they told reporters why they were going to. The first comment stated, quote, "If this isn't anti-Semitic, I don't know what is," end quote. And a second comment in Newsday from this same militant group stated, quote, "We're out here because we give a damn. We're going to make sure nothing happens," end quote. But like I mentioned, the students weren't thrilled with the fact that they were there, and I do wonder, John, if it goes back to what you were saying about their religion and not wanting, armed guards around and things like that. But some of these students were reported to have been yelling things at these group members like, quote, "We don't want you. We feel safe with the police," as well as, quote, "You're causing more problems. Please go away," end quote.
Well, that could also be the rabbi speaking through the children.
That's true.
Because he could have some type of hold over them.
Mm-hmm.
Not like it's their religion. They're not being indoctrinated into something, but if he is, the man there that you obey, you listen to, he is teaching you.
He's not necessarily. There were multiple rabbis, and that was something that kind of
okay, so he's not like the headmaster.
There's him, and then there's the principal of the school, who was Rabbi Cooper. So there's more than one rabbi, but I think they all have different roles. There's the principal, there's directors, there's other faculty members that are higher up.
So what was Lezin's position then?
I am not entirely sure. I think he may have been a director, but I'm not positive.
I would assume that if he's the one that's talking to police and more or less giving public statements, he must have had more authority than the rest of them. Because even though everybody's a rabbi, there must be different levels or different tenure or...
Yeah, kind of like with just teaching or a college or something. You have your head of a department, and then you have all the other professors underneath.
Right,
so maybe it was something like that.
Yeah, if this guy's been a rabbi for 30 years,
yep,
and then everybody else has only been on for, 20 or less, he's the head rabbi.
Yeah,
or the most important, or has the most say.
Yeah, it's at the end of the day, you can all give your opinions, but maybe it's his decision that is the one that stands. So if he doesn't agree with the 5 or so people under him, and he says, "No, I want to do what I want to do," I think the final saying would come down to him. And I think that's why, with the militant group, it was well, Rabbi Lezin said no, not any of the other rabbis. So,
well, maybe they didn't have the opportunity to.
Yeah, definitely possible.
They could have had a different opinion, but they keep their mouth shut because Rabbi Lezin is the one above them.
And if what he wants is this, then that's what we're going to go with.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so now, a little bit later on, roughly several weeks after Hayam was killed, further information regarding the scene of the crime was actually released. It was stated that Hayam's body had in fact been moved from the place where he was killed, which, remember, was in his bed while he was sleeping. But come to find out, he'd been moved from the bed where he had been stabbed to the floor, but also then moved a second time a little bit further over on the floor. His feet were also propped up against the bed. But the craziest thing to come out is that Hayam's body had supposedly been in a different position for hours prior to him being moved to the other spot, which I take to mean that he was on the bed for hours after he'd been killed, then he was moved later from the bed to the floor.
Yeah, I would think so. So the place he was murdered was the bed.
Correct.
While he was sleeping. Then he was moved to the floor at some point, and then moved further into a different location on the floor after that.
Yes.
And if you're talking hours later, the only two options really are the murderer was there for that long, or he was moved after he was found.
Well, someone that was labeled as a police source close to the investigation told Newsday, quote, "It could have been moved by someone who came in, saw it, and tried to help, or it could have been moved by the suspect who left, then came back for some reason," end quote.
Okay, I could see that too. And if it was somebody that was in the building, they could have left and come back prior to anybody finding him.
Yes, but knowing all that, so he was either moved by someone trying to help, like the police source said, or that leaves the option that the killer came back. But then that brings me back to what we were talking about earlier, the fact that students apparently didn't hear a single thing that night, which is just so strange to me now, considering this and some other things. So, 1, apparently you had to go through multiple rooms to get to Hayam's dorm room. A student who attended the school back in '86 was interviewed by Pix 11 later on, like literally decades later, but he stated, quote, "They must have known exactly where this kid was because you had to go through a lot of different rooms to find him, and you had to pass a lot of kids to get to this kid," end quote. Which, if that's the case, we're now considering the fact that someone came in through other dorm rooms multiple times throughout the night and didn't wake anyone.
Or it was somebody that was in those dorm rooms, those connecting dorm rooms.
I mean, potentially, but...
I mean, you can't rule that out because
No,
if
you
nobody
can't.
heard anything, right? Like, say it's one big common room and then you have all these other rooms that branch off of it or whatever, and he has like a particularly private one. It's not outlandish to think that it could have been somebody else that was in one of those adjoining rooms or nearby rooms. Then you wouldn't have to worry about traveling through a lot of rooms.
Yeah.
You would just, leave theirs and go and...
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but you know what else is weird? Is that in the Unsolved Mysteries episode on this case, it's mentioned that a student noticed that their door had been opened at least once or twice that night. And, I mean, at the time, the groggy student was like, oh, it's just my roommate, whatever, like they're sleeping. But now that we know this information, that makes me think, like, did the killer come through this kid's dorm room to then get into Hayam's room, and maybe this student could have potentially been witness to whoever did it?
Yeah, that's very odd, though. Like, say you were a groggy student and, you wake up and somebody's opening your door and walking through your room. If it's somebody that you don't know, you're going to be freaked out and you're going to make a scene and you're going to say something. Versus if it's somebody that goes to school with you or an administrator that maybe comes through and checks on the rooms to make sure people are asleep and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Maybe there were people that went around and made rounds throughout the night to make sure nobody was up to anything mischievous or
maybe
anything like that. So,
all right, I see what you're saying. I can get on board with that.
I really don't think it's somebody outside the school.
I don't think so either. So let's keep going. At this point in the story, something else very weird starts to get reported on, and that goes back to something else yet again that I mentioned earlier about the weird stuff that I felt like might have been going on at the yeshiva, and then the public and all these people were just acting weird, and I thought there was some underlying sketchiness going on. So, a short time after Hayam was killed, the big thing in the news was that there was some sort of lawsuit going on with the yeshiva. Honestly, things are really wishy-washy and very confusing regarding the whole situation, so please forgive me if I'm misconstruing anything, but this is how I took what was reported on. Apparently, at some point after Hayam's murder, things were so bad that the school almost had to shut down, or best case, move to another location on Long Island. The rabbi at the time had said, like, enrollment was down, students had left like we talked about before. So I guess I can understand from that perspective. But then apparently this whole lawsuit somehow came from this whole situation because a group of residents in the community went to court to block the yeshiva from being able to even leave or to close down or whatever because it was a, quote, critical pillar for Jews in the community, end quote. So you've got residents, locals, suing the school, saying, no, you can't leave. You can't shut down. Like, we need this here. So I'm like, all right, well, like, what the heck is going on here? I was totally lost.
Yeah, I don't understand that lawsuit. Like, how can you sue an essential private entity to prevent them from leaving?
Well, here's where it gets a little weirder. Come to find out, the rabbis and the directors and the principal, whoever's in charge of the school, sold the school, and this lawsuit was brought forward to essentially force them to buy it back.
Interesting.
And it's just so strange, like the way it's reported on and like what's discussed about it. But then just based on some additional reporting on this subject, it seems like these things might have been going on with the yeshiva prior to Hayam's murder.
I would assume so.
Yeah, then things got worse, obviously, after the fact, when enrollment was down, all of that. And I don't know if, like, something was sparked because now, like, the school had been sold and now it's, like, losing students and, like, are they going to be losing more tuition money, like, all of this stuff?
Yeah, I would assume that this whole sale of the building was going on before the murder of Hayam took place.
Yeah.
But then, like, that had its own drama that it was causing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had the murder, which had probably parents pulling their kids out of the school.
Mm-hmm.
So lower tuition, things like that. So maybe, maybe when they sold the building, they had to pay rent. Like, maybe there was some type of agreement where the yeshiva could stay there, but they had to pay rent. And now with the reduction of students, they didn't have enough money to pay rent. And that's why they were going to be moving to another location.
Yeah, I mean, that could be totally possible. And I do just want to say, too, like, I don't know if there's any sort of connection here with this, but it was one of those things where it's like, it's something that was going on. There are lawsuits happening. There are people that are angry with what's going on at the yeshiva and, like, thinking that, stuff is going on behind closed doors. They didn't seem to be, I'm not sure, but they didn't seem to be public about the sale of the school. Like, so I don't know what, if any, type of connection there might be, but I still think it's important to know what was going on. But then there's this comment that I read in Newsday that, like, completely threw me for a loop, and I don't know if it's just, like, for shock value and, like, a reporter is saying this because it's like, oh, could it be connected? Just to kind of
start shit.
Almost, yeah. So let me just read it for you. It says, quote, the buyer, according to records, was the 5743 Holdson Corp., a New Jersey-based company owned by Heshi Singer, a former student at the school.
I was going to say, that sounds like a Jewish name.
Yeah. A former student at the school, Singer, in his early 30s, had resigned as a school trustee shortly after Weiss was murdered. It was unclear why he resigned, and Singer declined to discuss it, end quote.
Yeah, he probably didn't want to be attached to the school after something like that happened in there.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, if he owned the company that bought the school, why would he then resign as a trustee?
I don't know. I don't know enough about trustees and shit like that to really give an input on that.
It's just weird, though. Like, the whole background, the fact that there's a lawsuit, the fact that, like, someone's resigning, like, all of it just seems like goes back to what authorities are thinking, that it could be a faculty member or a student or, like, someone involved with the school here. I do not think this is anti-Semitism driven. I do not think that this is an outsider from their community. Yeah,
it doesn't seem that way. One question I would have is, were Hayam's parents at all involved in this lawsuit?
Not
like
this
one. Like a front runner type thing? No?
Not this one.
Okay, but another one.
Yeah. So before we move into that, the lawsuit from, like, the residents did end up getting dropped, and they negotiated some sort of deal that kept the yeshiva in place, and there really didn't seem to be much more reported on this whole subject. So I was like, I'm lost. Like, I don't really understand what's going on here, why this is happening. Like, it was just a very weird situation. But like I just said, this wasn't the only lawsuit against the school. Another was going to come about roughly a year and a half to 2 years after Hayam had been murdered. In November of 1988, it was reported that Anton Weiss, Hayam's father, was suing the school, stating that they, quote, have refused to help find his son's killer, end quote. There was yet another article in Newsday that reported on the reasoning behind this lawsuit. The passage in the Newsday article stated, quote, Anton Weiss claims in the civil suit served against the school last week that his 15-year-old son, Hayam, was murdered on Halloween night solely as a result of the negligence, carelessness, and recklessness of school officials at the Masivta of Long Beach. The school is guilty of reckless disregard for human safety, the lawsuit contends, end quote.
That's a tough one.
Yes.
To prove.
Yes. And the lawsuit, mind you, was for like $15 million. Yeah. And his dad did vow to donate any money that he won from it to charity, but I just want to go back to like the whole thing with Rabbi Lezin and kind of how it was like a little bit sus that he didn't want, these armed guards. Sure, it could have definitely been a religious thing, but, I'm sure that Hayam's family was like, what the heck? Like, my son was just killed, and like, you don't want to protect other students either. You don't want to help us. You don't want to figure out who did this. So then that just keeps adding more and more again to the theory of it's somebody involved in this yeshiva, or at least in this community.
Yeah, I can see how they kind of coincide with each other.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I don't get, though, is the lawsuit sounded like it revolved around the murder happened because of the administration's disregard for the children, or for everyone that was in there. But if you're upset that the people within the yeshiva aren't assisting in finding your son's killer, saying the murder happened because of their disregard does not send the same message as they're refusing to help find my son's murderer.
Yeah, okay. So, first of all, I do want to say there's like two sides to this. So there's the side of what happened after Hayam was murdered and saying, you're not doing enough to help find my son's killer. And I don't know if that has to do with like not cooperating with investigators or whatever. I'm not sure what that really means. I do know that they did put in a security system. They were trying to do other things to protect the students. But then just based on how this reads and other things that are reported, it seems as though at the heart of it, the lawsuit really is regarding the fact that there was not enough safety at the school, or not enough safety measures in place at the school before Hayam's murder.
So it should have never happened, and because there weren't enough safety precautions put in ahead of time, that's why this occurred.
Correct. And then there's this statement that comes out later, and it says that apparently there was a lock broken on one of the back doors of the dorm building, and that there supposedly was not a dorm counselor in the building on the night of Hayam's murder. So I don't know how accurate any of that information is, if this is just an alleged statement coming out to say, like, this is what the Weiss family believed was going on, but whether the school said that wasn't true, or if there was a dorm advisor in there or whatever, I think at the end of the day, the lawsuit is at the heart of there were not safety precautions in place to make it so that this would never have happened in the first place.
Gotcha. But they still were very unhappy with the amount of effort that was being put in from the yeshiva to find the killer.
Correct. And I can't quite tell what that lack of effort was, whether they were like putting up a wall and like not saying anything, or if they were like specifically like hindering the investigation or what. But there's one thing that's reported on like way later regarding this situation that I think is important for me to bring up now. The principal of the school at the time was Rabbi Cooper. I had mentioned that before. So we have Rabbi Lezin and we have Rabbi Cooper. Well, apparently Rabbi Cooper had something to say to Anton in court back then. Pix 11 reported on what took place. The article stated, quote, Rabbi Cooper suggested Weiss reflect on any bad deeds he may have done as a way of considering why bad fortune may have come to the Weiss family, end quote.
That's another thing I was thinking about. Was Hayam targeted because of something his parents had done, or his father? Or I always go back to, you said that, his dad was involved in the jewelry business. Mm-hmm. Was there some bad blood there? You know that within the Orthodox community, there's always, at least it seems this way, there's always like, oh, they're involved in jewelry, they're involved in precious goods and stuff like that, and a lot of their careers are around
surrounding that. Yep.
Like the sales of stuff like that, and banking and things of that nature. So could he have done something and then somebody targeted his son because of it?
Or is this a way of the school deflecting and saying like, maybe you must have done a bad thing for this bad fortune to come upon your family?
That seems like a very religious thing to say.
And it seems like a really dick thing to say. Yes. Honestly, that's fucked up to say to someone whose child was murdered.
Right. Yes. But that's somebody from like, a high place of power in like a religious setting being like, maybe you should look inwards instead of trying to come after us for the problem. Yeah. Maybe it's because of you, and bad fortune befell your family because of something you did.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's, at least for me, I took it as like, you're trying to push that on somebody else and take blame off yourself because either you feel bad or you know something, or it just seemed like there was something going on there. So
yeah, just trying to get the eye away from the yeshiva as opposed to somebody else.
Yep. So after this quick burst of information came out in the news regarding Hayam's murder for the first year or two roughly, not much else came out for a couple years. But what is released at this point seems like something that could be very helpful in terms of authorities' investigation and honestly, our analysis of this as we're, working through the case. So, in March of 1992, the FBI actually released a profile of the characteristics of this killer. And due to my love of criminal minds, this is something I really like to have to be able to analyze in a case that we cover. So, for starters, before we dive into the profile itself, there's something you need to know so you're not totally blindsided when I talk about it in a second. A tidbit of information was released regarding Hayam himself. The article in Newsday stated, quote, Chaim Weiss, the report says, was regarded by faculty members as the brightest of the bright. Students saw him as popular and generous, but someone who had a sharp tongue, which could have been a factor in his death, the report said, end quote. So first of all, this is no reason for any normal person to have as a motive to kill somebody, but I think it's important that you know this particular bit of info about Hayam before we discuss the profile of the perpetrator.
I have an idea of what this profile might entail, and I'll tell you if I agree with it.
Okay. So, now that we have that info, especially after we knew how disciplined and popular and well-liked Hayam was, I think this seems to be something that is very important and could really lend credence to a potential motive here and then subsequently finding the person responsible. So from what I can tell, the FBI seemed to have landed on jealousy as the potential motive. Here's some of what the profile says. Quote, it is opined that Weiss was not a victim of opportunity, but was pre-selected. His murder was planned in advance by someone who knew him well, end quote. That piece I think we already had nailed down. Yeah. Right. But the profile goes on to state, quote, the victim's reported ability to be verbally abusive and critical of others, combined with the assailant's depressed and frustrated state and his sense of envy towards the victim's achievements, conceivably played a significant role in motivating the assailant to commit this crime, end quote.
Okay.
It continues, quote, the assailant is described as highly intelligent, but someone who is criminally unsophisticated, likely of the same age group as the victim. The fact that the killer went unnoticed and is believed to have returned to the room after the crime, but before Hayam was discovered, suggests the killer was familiar with the dorm, end quote. The FBI also deduced that robbery and anti-Semitism were not what they believed to be the motive for this murder. Like I said, they kind of landed on jealousy. Something else is also clarified in this profile as well. It reads, quote, in all probability, the offender would have had to have been close enough to know that Weiss's body had not been discovered before returning to the scene. Upon re-entry, the assailant found the dorm room dark and raised the shade to provide additional light. Weiss's body was moved by the assailant, either to provide easier access to the window and shade, or for the assailant to look under the body for anything incriminating left there. The window may have been opened by the assailant to discard some items which he later retrieved, end quote. Now that brings me right back to those questions I had earlier regarding if the killer was a student living in the same building, which, I mean, just based on this profile, it seems like that's very possible. And then it goes back to what you were saying, John, regarding the fact that it could have been someone in an adjoining dorm room. Because like they said, they would have had to have known that no one had found his body yet. Right.
So they're saying that the window, I assume, is over the bed, or the bed is under the window.
Yeah.
And they're saying that incriminating material could have been thrown out the window?
Yes.
And then maybe picked up later when they went outside? And then disposed of?
Assuming, yeah.
Somewhere else?
Okay, so now, also in 1992, but this time in May, the Unsolved Mysteries episode on this case aired. There was information in that episode that described some reasoning as to why Hayam's body might have been moved, like we were discussing. It seems that it may have been based in Jewish traditions. So how I understand it is that when somebody dies, their body should be placed at the lowest point of whatever space they're in, and also the coolest point in the room, which I thought was pretty fascinating. So you have to think, like, if he was killed in his bed and then say the perpetrator left and they were like, you know, having like this crisis in their head of like, I need to make sure, even though I've done this horrible thing, I still need to follow my traditions. And maybe they came back and they were like, I need to move him here. I need to do the right thing. I need to put him in the lowest place, in the coolest place.
Yep.
So I think, again, it's like all these little tidbits that we're learning as we go keep bringing you back to following along with this profile and the idea that, again, this person is either among this community or knows this community very, very, very well.
I think among the community. I think in the building, a student, I think that the whole jealousy portion, like when you had been saying earlier that he was very well liked, he was like popular, smart, the whole jealousy portion plays a big part in that. You have a very small group of people that are always around each other. So if he's like, you know, always viewed as, oh, he's the best, and then you have this other guy that's like, oh, you know, I'm just as good, I'm so tired of this. Oh, I'm always
like,
getting
get him out of my way.
Right.
Yeah.
And then if Hayam had a sharp tongue and he talked shit to this guy or made him look stupid in front of other people.
Yeah, like if he like came up and did a presentation in class or something and he corrected him and, you know, this kid. I mean, people harbor resentment for the silliest of things that we might not think are, you know, a big deal. But in this case, maybe, you know, Hayam just said one wrong thing and this person just held on to that and had this crazy resentment and then was just pissed off every single time he would get like accolades and all this other stuff and be like, that's it, I'm done.
Right. Well,
like,
we go back to Gary Grant Jr. With a person whose name was put forward as a potential suspect. You know, Gary Sr. said that he had no problem with him.
Yeah.
But for all we know, they could have harbored resentment for something that they had done. And
yes, exactly. Now, it's also discussed in the Unsolved Mysteries episode that a candle had actually been left in Hayam's room. Well, actually 2 candles. One was originally left by one of the rabbis at the time, and then the dorm had been closed indefinitely, like I mentioned earlier. But now this time, just a few days after Hayam had been killed and after all the students had moved out of the building, another candle was lit and left in the dorm room. But no one ever came forward stating that they were the ones to leave the candle there. So then you have to wonder, was it the killer that left the candle?
Yeah, it could have been.
Something else I wanted to circle back to as well that I did mention earlier on had to do with the fact that students weren't talking to authorities about really anything in terms of the case because of another part of their religion. In Orthodox Judaism, if you do not have definitive, solid proof of something, suspicion alone is not enough to say anything about what you potentially might know. So this, I guess, rule to follow could be a huge hindrance to this case. Saying like, I don't know for sure, so I'm not going to accuse anybody of anything or say anything.
Right, so that student that noticed that his door was open a couple times could have seen somebody walking through the room, but because he didn't actually physically see that person murder Hayam, he's not going to say anything about it.
That's exactly what I was going to go back to. And if he was like, oh, it was Joe Schmo that walked through my room, he's not going to go tell the police, Joe Schmo walked through my room because he's not sure that he's involved. And even though it's such a little thing, it could implicate him, and then he is, you know, not following his religion as he is supposed to, so he won't say anything. And that is such a hard thing for someone to come to terms with. I am sure, like, anybody in this school that could potentially have knowledge, but they're like, I cannot break this. I cannot break this tradition or this rule.
Yeah, because you think, even now, like years later, they could be outcast from their community for giving any information that's not, you know, proven to be fact.
Yeah, and imagine saying something and then it turns out it's not that person, and then you've done this
been ostracized. You've been ostracized now for giving information that ended up not being anything. You've caused the persecution of some other person, and it's a tough spot to be in when you think you have good information and you're just restricted from saying anything.
And imagine being investigators too, like knowing that there's probably information out there. And the majority
there's definitely
of
information out there.
There's definitely information out there. And it's like, really, your only witnesses are completely immersed in this religion, and their religion says do not say anything, essentially.
Yeah, and I mean, that's, I would say the Orthodox Judaism community is not the only community that would be like that.
No,
I'm sure there are tons of communities within New York, in particular, where they're like, no, we deal with shit on our own. We're not going to say anything to police, and then we're going to do our own stuff.
I totally get that. Now, one last really big thing that comes out in this Unsolved Mysteries episode as well that I hadn't seen reported anywhere prior to its release was the fact that there was a jogger seen that was apparently believed to be potentially a yeshiva student, and they were seen running a few blocks from the school around 7 a.m. on November 1st, which was the morning Hayam's body was discovered.
It's probably whoever would have thrown things out the window, going out for a morning jog, grabbing his shit that he threw out the window, and then disposing of it somewhere else.
Totally possible. And someone said that this person seemed like they didn't belong in the area, that it was odd for them to be there and it stood out to them. But this person has never been identified, so it's totally unclear if it's just this person just seemed out of sorts in this area, or if it could have actually been the person that did this. They grabbed the weapon, like you said, or grabbed whatever they discarded from the window, and then they were running, whatever. I mean, this was all within the time frame that it would work, because Hayam's body was found between 7:30 and 8 o'clock in the morning, and we know based on what the ME said, he was killed after 1:20 a.m. So you have that window, and it does make sense, but unfortunately there hasn't ever been anything else reported on this jogger.
Well, I mean, it's different to say, I saw somebody jogging versus I saw a Hasidic Jew jogging. So.
Yeah. But unfortunately, from 1992, when this Unsolved Mysteries episode was released and the profile, to roughly 2013, not much else took place in this case, at least not publicly. It was pretty much totally quiet in the media, no new leads, or at least none that were reported on, but the case was officially reopened in 2013. At this point, a reward for $25,000 was apparently offered by a family member of Hayam's, and this seemed to be what prompted investigators to then reopen the case. And then at that point is when more information, or I guess kind of information we knew already, is really solidified and clarified, and more comes out. So let's work through each piece together. First of all, the presiding theory at this point is that whoever did this was a part of the Orthodox Jewish community, whether that be a faculty member of the yeshiva, a student at the yeshiva, or someone else within that community, which I think we've already kind of come to that conclusion.
Yeah, it's just, there's no other way that somebody else outside would have made their way in unnoticed. And
not only that, though, this belief was sparked by the fact that whoever did this was very familiar with Orthodox Jewish traditions.
And the yeshiva itself to be able to get through.
Navigate it, exactly. Now, we had talked a little bit before regarding the fact that Hayam's body was moved to the coolest and lowest point of the room after he was killed, which was a part of the religious rules per se on death. But now there's even more to go along with that. So, for starters, the window in Hayam's room had been opened. We learned about that from the profile. But this was yet another Jewish tradition, and it was said that a window should be opened after someone has died as a way
to let the spirit out.
To let their soul leave the room. Exactly.
Yep.
This was significant before in terms of the perpetrator potentially ditching the weapon that way, but now learning that the window was actually left open, not closed afterwards, also in the cold of November in New York, mind you, it definitely makes me think it has more to do with tradition than convenience of ditching something.
The two could still go hand in hand. But yes, now knowing that there is a religious connotation with that, it does lead more towards, okay, maybe this was, part of the whole ceremony of opening the window so their soul could leave or their spirit could leave, putting their body at the coolest point in the room. And at the same time, it was convenient because you could throw something out the window, go pick it up the next morning, maybe go jogging, and ditch it somewhere else.
Totally possible. Second, we talked about the candle that was left in the dorm room before, but apparently it was a specific type of candle, a religious candle known as a yortzeit. And like I mentioned before, that was placed in the dorm room after it had been closed up and no students were living in it.
I don't know if I think it's the killer that came back to leave that, or maybe a family member or a close friend wanted to come in and leave that candle lit because they missed the person.
But why would you never say, if authorities were like, oh, who put this candle in here? It's important to the investigation, and no one ever came forward about it? What's embarrassing about leaving a candle for a loved one?
If it were a friend or a close family member that was not involved in the murder, they know that it's not important to the investigation because they're the one that left it there. there are also ones that don't necessarily want to talk to the police.
Mm-hmm.
And you also could think of it from the point of view of, I don't want to tell the police that I broke into this place to leave this candle because I don't want to be implicated in possibly being involved.
Yeah.
I did it out of the goodness of my heart because I wanted to leave the candle there, so.
I mean, maybe. I don't know. I just think, like, if it were me, I'd be like, I know that no matter what they do, they're never going to be able to say that I did this. It's like I didn't live in the dorm, like, say it was a family member or something, like, or I, definitely wasn't involved, and I know that there's no way they're ever going to be able to say that I was involved because I have an alibi or I have this or that. Why wouldn't you just say, like, it was me?
Yeah, I guess it's just better to not say anything. If you're doing it for your own purpose and you know that you didn't do anything wrong, you're just as well off, probably better off not saying that it was you than you are telling the police that it was you, because then you just entangle yourself into this whole thing. They're going to be asking you all these other questions. Well, why did you go back in there? It was blocked off. It was, you're not supposed to be in there. What made you do it? It's just questions that you'd have to answer that you don't need to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. I get both sides of it.
It could go either way.
Yeah.
But I'm not looking at it from just the sole perspective of, oh, it's the killer going back there to, like, make penance for what they did.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I just think at the end of the day, it seems like everything lumped together just has to do with the Jewish traditions. And, like, you have the candle, you have the window open, you have him being moved to the floor, like, you have all these things. So it's like, again, and I'm just going to say it for like the 400th time in this episode, it just keeps going back to who could have been responsible, knowing that it just has to be somebody who not only knows these traditions, but practices them.
Yeah, and I think we both agree on that.
Yeah. Now, the other situation regarding the religious beliefs of the individuals potentially involved has to do with what we talked about before regarding not coming forward until there's definitive proof to accuse someone. Authorities, however, came out with a statement to plead to anyone who might know something about what happened to come forward despite that belief. The Long Island Herald reported what was stated, quote, "The homicide squad is aware of the Jewish Orthodox belief that one should not call anyone to account unless there is positive proof that that individual was involved in such incident. We are sensitive to and respect that belief. However, a homicide has occurred, and we need any information that can help us solve this case and bring justice and peace to the Weiss family. The police department is not asking anyone to accuse someone, but to only come forward with information pertaining to this case," end quote. And like we said before, like, I think there's kind of a gray area here. And, like, I see what detectives are saying, but then knowing the strictness of the religion, I feel like it could be very hard for someone who might know something to throw their beliefs to the wayside to help in this instance. Just to go back to what we said before about, not wanting to feel like they could potentially be ostracized from their community or something like that, where it's like they broke a big rule and then...
Yeah, I just... you must be very devout in your faith and your beliefs in order to not come forward with information if your friend was just murdered.
Well, also, how couldn't you be, though? This is their entire life. This is 11 months of the year.
I understand
spending
that. I understand that, but it's 11 months of the year, and you are with your friends 11 months of the year. Like, you live with them. They're essentially family. So unless the boy who noticed that his door was open knew about what happened or had some inclination of who was involved or maybe was a participant themselves.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why nobody really had information.
Yeah, I think it just sucks. It's like a hard thing to overcome whichever way you look at it. And
especially because, like, the Weiss family wants answers too.
Of course.
It's not like the Weiss family is like, no, I'm not going to talk to police because this is something that's going to be taken care of by our community.
Yeah.
We're going to deal with it together. It's like, even they're upset that nobody's coming forward and nobody's helping. So when you look at it from, their perspective, they're devout in their beliefs, right? And their faith, but they still want people to come forward and give information.
Absolutely.
So it's like, how close of a relationship do you have to have with this murdered person that you'd be willing to go against
your traditions? Yeah, I agree.
And your values or whatever. So,
All right. So detectives also released further information during this time, and they stated that there is DNA evidence in this case, but that there's only a very, very small sample left, and if it were to be tested, they could never test again because it would use the remainder of that sample. Investigators also mentioned that they were even considering traveling to Israel to speak with students and faculty that are now living in Israel that used to attend the Masivta of Long Island back in '86. The Long Island Herald reported what the detective lieutenant at the time said regarding why they wanted to talk to more people on this case nearly 25 years later. Quote, "We feel after this time period, maybe we can get more information, new leads, and go in new directions. There is somebody out there that knows a secret. I'm looking for that person to give me that secret," end quote.
Yeah, I would say that's a great route to go, because back when this happened, I think it's a difficult position to put the people who are in the yeshiva in to pry information out of them.
Yep.
Because they're still in a vulnerable position, going to school, having to complete their studies versus somebody that's moved away that really has no
risk of like losing this big thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, even if they gave, if they had a change of heart and on their values or whatever, and they were like,
even
yeah, I'll give you a little bit.
anonymously.
Exactly.
Yep.
If they gave information anonymously, it's like, yeah, I'm not going to go on record saying this, but,
Yeah.
this is what I heard that night. This is what I saw that night. This is what kids were talking about at the time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so we've got all this under our belt. But now, a few years later, in 2017, Anton Weiss did an interview where he revealed some more things about what happened back, really since '86 through till today. But this is where I think the theories in this case might come out a little bit more, and they might even solidify themselves a little bit more. At least they did for me, so I'm very curious to see where you land.
Theories? Theories, yes. I think there are some like really outlandish theories, like this is anti-Semitism, this is somebody outside. And I think the one overarching theory is that it was somebody from inside the building. Yeah,
but this is like, that feels like an overarching theory.
And
I think
really
you're going to get a more specific theory now.
Okay.
So much earlier on in the episode, we were talking about the strict studies at the yeshiva and kind of what their school year was structured like. We had talked about how the students had a 6-week camp in the summer, which still was very rigorous, like, that journalist had reported. The studies were still strict, even though it was like summertime and they were at summer camp, right? Well, apparently, according to Anton's interview in 2017, Hayam had called his parents that July in 1986, just several months before he was killed, saying he wanted to come home and was even so upset about whatever was going on that he was crying. According to Pix 11's reporting on this, Anton stated, quote, "He called me up crying in a strong way that he wants to come home. I was away on vacation and I told him, wait until I come back," end quote. Unfortunately, though, there isn't much information on that, as I don't think his parents really pried very much to try and get anything out of him because, at the time, it probably didn't mean too much. Like when he got there after, his vacation and he picked him up from camp, all things seemed fine and there was nothing to really talk about.
So whatever was going on had to have been going on prior to the phone call being made, and then maybe afterwards it subsided a bit?
I would think so, yeah, because obviously the dad was away, so he couldn't come get him. So you would have to assume at least a couple days, maybe a week or two went by. And then by that point, it's like, oh, if this isn't in the forefront of my mind, like I'm not angry or upset about it anymore, maybe you're just not going to talk about it.
Or maybe the kid didn't want to talk about it at that point.
Also true.
After he had gone through and, overcome or gotten through whatever event was causing him an issue.
Yeah.
Maybe he was like, I'm not even going to talk about it, or I don't want to talk about it, and he was closed off about it.
Andy is a 15-year-old boy.
Right,
I get it's a different time, and, he's a part of this religious community, but, 15-year-old boys probably don't want to talk to their parents about everything going on in life.
Right, but it makes you wonder what was going on to make this popular, well-liked boy cry, call his parents, and say, I want to come home.
Yeah, you would have to think it's probably bad enough.
Right. It's got to be something pretty fucked up.
Exactly. So there's another piece of information that Anton discloses that just honestly gave me a pit in my stomach when I was researching this, and it really made me think that there's something else going on here. And I don't know exactly what, but whatever it is, it made me a little sick to my stomach. So we'd talked a bunch about Rabbi Lezin before, but there was that other rabbi, the one who was described as the principal of the school at the time, and that was Rabbi Cooper. Well, I had only mentioned him briefly, and one of the times that I mentioned him was when we were talking about the lawsuit that Anton had filed against the yeshiva, and then the comment that Rabbi Cooper made about potential bad deeds being why bad luck befell his family, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm just going to throw it out there right now. What's discussed about some of the things that Rabbi Cooper allegedly said and did makes me very uncomfy. So at some point while Hayam was away in Europe visiting his grandparents, prior to the school year in 86, I'm pretty sure, Rabbi Cooper called the Weiss family home to attempt to chat with Hayam. Of course, Anton or Pessy or whoever answered the phone told him that Hayam wasn't around and that he'd be back in a few days or weeks or whatever, whenever he returned from Europe. Well, Rabbi Cooper really wanted to talk to Hayam, so he allegedly called a second time as well. And then, once Hayam returned home from Europe, a time was set up for the two to chit-chat. His parents drove him to what I do believe was Rabbi Cooper's home, and they waited outside for the two to have whatever discussion they were going to have.
I already know where this is going.
Okay, well, keep listening.
And it was in the back of my mind because now when you think of any religion, you think of fucked up shit that goes on in the religion. But go on, continue.
Yes, so Pix 11's reporting on the case stated the following regarding the conversation. Quote, "The teen's father said Hayam spent about 10 minutes in the house, but when the teen returned to the car, Hayam didn't want to talk about the conversation. Anton Weiss said he asked his son what the principal and Hayam discussed. When Hayam was reluctant to speak about it, the father didn't press him on it. He now wishes he had pressed more." End quote.
Well, it makes me think that immediately you go to pedophilia because all the stuff that's come out from the Catholic Church and shit, and maybe something happened at camp where Cooper might have been. That's why Hayam wanted to come home.
Even if it wasn't Cooper, even if it was somebody else, but like they knew about it too.
And he was the principal and like he knew about what was going on. He wanted to have that talk with him to make sure that he wouldn't say anything, to form some type of story around the religion. Oh, you won't go to heaven, or you won't, I don't even know where Orthodox Jews believe they go after they die, but, formulate around like some type of religious aspect as to why you shouldn't say anything and why you can't say anything. And, if you do, something bad will happen to you or your family type thing.
And then you see why.
And then maybe Hayam couldn't be trusted to keep his mouth shut about it. And then maybe he was targeted and killed to keep him quiet about bad shit that was going on.
Well, so I had a bunch of thoughts on this, and you covered a couple of them. But I then went back to one of my very first questions in this episode, and that was, why did Hayam have a private dorm? And I had questions about this before, and they were temporarily quelled with that statement regarding the randomization of the decision. But now I'm thinking, is there a more nefarious reason for this? Was there favoritism? Was it, I'll give you this private room if you keep your mouth shut? Like all these other things. I'm like, now he's having this private conversation with a rabbi outside of school. He's calling him technically on his summer break while he's on vacation in Europe. He needs to talk to him desperately.
Right.
He's now, Hayam's crying at summer camp, like all these things.
He doesn't want to talk about the conversation that the two had.
Yeah. And that's what I go back to is like, why was there a private dorm?
He was chosen and he was selected.
He's not randomly chosen.
Right, but he was chosen to be, maybe their, I don't even know what you would call it, like their victim, essentially, in whatever
could have been
going on.
Yeah.
And then, yes, given this private dorm, maybe given the private dorm as payment or as like a bonus for like keeping your mouth shut or being selected for whatever shady shit's going on, or to be able to have private meetings with people in that dorm room. I know you had to go through multiple other rooms to get into there, but
still you're alone in the room.
Right, once the door is shut and you're alone in the room, what happens in there? Yeah, very interesting.
So, reporters for Pix 11 even tried speaking with Rabbi Cooper, but after they pressed him pretty hard about what took place back in 86, and, the reporter was like asking him, like, what happened between you two during this conversation? He refused to speak. He was very standoffish. He's like, I have no answers for you. And he like walked back into his house. He was like, of course. No way. I'm not speaking to you about this. But like we were just saying, I go back to the whole thing that Rabbi Cooper supposedly said to Anton back in court in 88 about the whole bad fortune thing. And Anton told Pix 11 in 2017 when he had that interview, quote, "It shocks me to today. What do you think? I stole something? I did something? I killed something?" End quote.
Well, that makes it even more like when you were saying he was trying to deflect, that Cooper was trying to deflect. If Cooper was directly involved in whatever was going on there involving Hayam and potentially his death as well, even more, I think that makes it even more clear that he was trying to deflect. He was like taking it directly from him, not taking it from the yeshiva and putting it onto somebody else. He was trying to get away from, any eyes looking at him, being like, hey, you need to look inside yourself because it was something you did, when it was really more likely something he had taken part in.
And then Anton's like, what the hell are you talking about?
Right.
Like, I've never done anything. Like, why are you trying to make me feel like this is my fault? Like, it's my family's fault. And I'm sure now to today, like, with him thinking about all these things that have been said, all this stuff that's come out, the weirdness of the summer camp, the weirdness of the meeting they had, he's probably like, this guy's saying this to me because he's got something going on that he doesn't want other people to know about.
Right. And I'm not saying that, pedophilia or sexual assault was the thing that was taking place there at the time.
Yep.
But if it was, it's like no group, no religion is free of stuff like this. It goes along with anybody that's in a position of power. You look at Hollywood with like the Me Too stuff where everybody was like, oh, Harvey Weinstein was making me, give blowjobs in order to get a scene and stuff like that. Then you have the Catholic Church. Can we say that this wasn't going on here or something similar? And maybe that's what happened at camp, and that's why Hayam wanted to leave. And then, Rabbi Cooper really wanted to speak with him so desperately
there must have been something
to smooth things over.
Yep, because so the timeline, just to make it clear, is July of 1986 is when Hayam was at camp and he was upset and he called his dad crying. Then in August, which I assume was probably like their month off because they did like the 6 weeks in the Catskills and then they had only an 11-month school year because Hayam was in Europe at that point. So in August of 86 is when
Cooper wanted to
talk to him and he called the house twice. Then when he came back, whatever it was, like a week or two later, then they met up. So I'm assuming sometime like end of August, maybe September.
Yeah.
And this is very close to the time frame of when he's murdered.
Right.
So timeline-wise, like all of it really does add up to something sketchy going on at the school.
And it makes sense, too. Like, if we're talking about this school year, was when Hayam got the private dorm, and the summer prior was when shit started getting weird and he wanted to leave camp, and then Cooper was trying to get in touch with him. If he didn't have that private dorm the year prior...
Well, so that was one of my questions. I'm like...
Was he just recently put into this?
Yes. Was this just a junior year thing?
Right.
Freshman and sophomore year, maybe he had a roommate. I don't know the answer to that. I want to know the answer to that.
Right. During that summer, the weird shit happened. Then junior year, now he gets the private dorm. Very interesting.
Yes. So...
And sus.
Well, so you were talking on the whole pedophilia side of things, but I want to tell you something else that came out in 2018, which is probably going to solidify some more things for you, but in kind of a different light. So in 2018, Pix 11 reported that a student who attended the yeshiva roughly a decade prior to Hayam's murder came forward to tell of the abuse he endured at the school. The article stated, quote, Weber said he was 14 years old then, but only survived a year there because of what he called systemic abuse imposed by one rabbi who beat me up on a regular basis, including punching, kicking, and twisting of the ear. Weber blamed the former principal for allowing the abuse to exist during his tenure. End quote. Not only that, but supposedly another student had committed suicide at the school at one point, which I believe happened a few years prior to when Hayam was killed. So if you've got students coming forward with, alleged statements of
abuse,
with statements of alleged abuse, it's like,
why was the abuse taking place, though, is the question. And I know in the autopsy they said that Hayam wasn't sexually assaulted. Sexual assault isn't just penetration on the victim.
Correct.
It could be forcing sexual favors by their assailant. I'm interested in knowing more about why this abuse took place. Like just beating people for no reason? It's strange.
So first of all, in this article, it talks about both the student that came forward to say that he was abused, and then there are comments regarding the suicide that took place. So the dean at the time was Rabbi Pitter, I believe, and his wife was asked about the whole suicide situation. She said, quote, "He wasn't in the school very long, and he had some problems. He was really depressed, and it was very tragic," end quote.
So I wonder if Rabbi Lezin was the dean at the time of Hayam's murder, and that's why he was the one giving statements and shit.
I am not sure. I think it might have been Rabbi Pitter. It might have been. There were multiple rabbis, and it was like one of those things, again, where it's like, I do my best to look at every single article that's reported on the case and not take like one thing as fact and like kind of compare and contrast. And of course, there's always freaking differences.
Right.
So it's like, oh, someone's the dean, someone's the principal, someone's this, someone's that. So it's like,
and it's tough when they all have the same title of rabbi.
yeah, that definitely gets hard. So I just think like, just based on this article, it is pretty short. There isn't too much information in it other than the fact that like this student came forward to say like, I dealt with this abuse, to talk about this student who committed suicide. But, you know, if the rabbi's wife is saying like, oh, we had some problems, like, I mean, maybe he did. Everybody's got issues, but.
Yeah. Is that in response to the suicide though?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those are tough conditions to live under for some people, even if you're, you know, born into that type of culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some people want to break out of that culture. I mean, you always hear about the Amish leaving the Amish, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I'm not entirely sure what everybody listening is thinking right now. I feel like you and I are on the same page, but overall, a lot of things have come full circle for me. And I think one of those things goes back to the idea of jealousy and the FBI, you know, coming out with that as the potential motive in their profile. And then I'm thinking like, what if other students saw the favoritism that the rabbis may have been giving Hayam, whether it's like...
Not knowing why they were giving him the favoritism now.
Exactly. So if a student's upset about this potential favoritism towards him and he's getting all these special things like a private dorm room and he's getting all this other stuff, you know, did they not really realize what was going on behind closed doors?
Not knowing the pain that was being caused or that he was suffering.
And maybe Hayam was lashing out with that sharp tongue because he was dealing with something that maybe was similar to what this other student was going through, maybe was something a little bit different. Not entirely sure what that could have been. But, you know, I think that at the end of the day, maybe it wasn't any of the faculty that was involved. It totally could have been a student who was upset about this favoritism that he was getting from the rabbis, but again, for just not a good reason.
Yeah, I think that if you had to lean one way or the other, I'm really torn. I'm about 50-50 on thinking if it was a student versus faculty member.
Yep.
To break it down a little bit, I think that when you have, you know, the kid that committed suicide there, but then also the kid that, you know, had to deal with abuse, he was being abused there. Did that kid that was being abused receive the same favoritism and favors that Hayam did? I feel like you don't give this kid all this favoritism and the private room and stuff like that if you're beating him. No. Right?
No,
you do that if you're trying to keep him quiet. You're trying to keep him happy and quiet and say, you know, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you, which leads me more along the lines of like the pedophilia and stuff that I was talking about before.
Yeah.
Because you're receiving a favor, but you're giving a favor.
Yeah.
Type
to
thing.
try and make it right in your own twisted mind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't think that the beating kind of go hand in hand. I think something fucked up happened at the camp. Then that's why Rabbi Cooper really wanted to talk to him. Like if he was beating him.
That timeline makes sense.
Right. If Rabbi Cooper knew about or was involved in beating Hayam, right? And he told his parents, oh, I got beat for whatever reason. Cooper could have been like, yeah, because he did something fucked up and that's why he was beaten.
Like, oh, how, you know, back in the day they used to smack people's hands with rulers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas if Hayam was like, you know, this guy made me fucking touch him, you don't do that because he did something wrong from a religious aspect. You do that because you're fucked up. And then if that word got out to his parents and he said something about it, then you have this whole thing unraveling. That's why that's why I believe Cooper would have been wanting to talk to him and smooth things over.
Yeah.
Not because he was beating him, but because there was something more scandalous happening.
Yeah, that you couldn't give any sort of justifiable reason for.
Right.
There's
And
no
then-
reason for that. It's you could give some sort of,
reasoning for getting beaten or for getting...
Yeah, and life was different in 86. You have to remember that too. Like, it's not like people, like teachers had
Right.
more authority over like students, especially
Right,
in
Catholic
that religious
schools, too.
capacity. Yeah.
Like you were saying, they're smacking your hands with rulers.
Yeah,
They
and
make
that
you
was...
kneel in the corner on frozen peas or something, you know?
Yeah, and then parents were like, good. It was like, that's what they need or whatever. Like, that would never in a million
Right.
years happen today. But back then, we have to like put ourselves in that mindset as well to say like, this is really fucked up now. Obviously, it was fucked up back then too. But
It was a different time.
it was a different time and people had different mindsets. So you do have to kind of put yourself there, even though it's difficult.
Mhm.
I agree with what you're saying. I'm definitely on board with that.
So I feel like if the profile said it had to do with jealousy or the killer was jealous, okay, you could get me to 51% saying it was probably a student.
Mhm.
But if Cooper knew of or was involved in fucked up shit going on there, and they were scared that Hayam was going to say something, like he was getting to the point where it's like, I can't keep this in anymore, I'm going to say
I'm gonna
something,
say it, yeah.
then I'm 51% on that side saying, no, it was a faculty member trying to keep this shit quiet.
Yep. Or then you look at the side of a student just harbored insane jealousy and they were like, F this kid, I'm so mad about
Right.
all of this. Like, I'm feeling slighted, even though it's, for a horrible reason. But they obviously wouldn't know that if they were keeping it quiet enough. So
Right. That's what I'm saying, where
the
it's like
the other side,
it's like 51% one way, 51% the other way based on...
depending on one little factor that can change your mind.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's like you could be split right down the middle.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that we can really solidly put our hat on is that it was somebody in that building.
Yes, I'm fully on board with that idea. So before we dive into the questions we're left with section, I did just want to bring up the fact that there were 2 additional people that had been mentioned that were looked into, but it didn't really seem like they panned out, but I did at least want to mention them before we wrap up. One was a janitor who apparently had left the school sometime after Hayam was killed, as well as a, quote, mentally ill drifter, but it didn't seem like either of those really panned out in terms of, finding who did this. I mean, a janitor maybe
Why?
could have known, like, some
Why would
Jewish
a janitor
traditions,
have-
but that doesn't make sense. Yeah.
No. Well, I would assume that if they were to have a janitor in there, it would have to be somebody probably from the community. I doubt that they're going to have people working inside there that aren't Jewish.
Oh, true. Yeah. Okay.
But why would a janitor just go in this kid's room and kill him?
Yeah. It just
That
didn't
doesn't
really
make
make sense. Like, of course, you have to look into every possibility. Like, oh, if he had like a weird past or like something like that. But
Nah.
just based on the FBI's profile, based on all the things that we've talked about, all the information that came out, at the end of the day, the solid belief that I have, at least in my mind, is that it's someone in the school, more than likely in the building.
Definitely not a drifter.
No, absolutely not. So with that, unfortunately, that is kind of where things are with this case as of today. The most recent thing that I had seen released was that information regarding the student who had committed suicide and then the other student who came forward regarding potential abuse. And again, there's just not much more that's come out since that. So I did just want to dive into the questions we're left with section. So, John, I don't know if you have any
I
off
tried
the
to
top
do better
of your...
this time
Yeah?
and write down my questions.
Okay, good.
So some of them we kind of went over a little bit, but why did Rabbi Lezin not want the militant group in there? Was
Okay.
there shit going on that he didn't want outsiders to see?
Yes, so I am curious about that as well, and I have a question that I think kind of like sort of aligns with that, and that is the fact that, like, why was he so dead set, like when he spoke to the media, that it was somebody outside of their community, that it was
Because
an
he doesn't want to
anti-Semitic
bring...
attack? Exactly, so that goes hand in hand.
Anti-Semites are an easy scapegoat for a Jewish community to say it was somebody outside,
Yes.
especially when you don't want prying eyes looking in. So if you have somebody that's part of the community saying, no, this is an anti-Semitic attack on our community, you need to start looking there. It's pointing your eyes in the complete opposite direction, or it's pointing investigators' eyes in the complete opposite direction versus, I mean, if Cooper knew something was going on or was involved in something, Lezin knew something about it too. So he wanted he wanted the investigators' gaze to be as far away from internal as possible. But
Yeah.
I mean, just from the information we have, it's clear that
Yep. And like ruling out the idea of anti-Semitism too, like even if we don't, like obviously we know authorities ruled that out, they said so, but you have to think too, like he spent every waking moment of his life for 2.5 years, studying, being a part of this school, being a part of, his religion so deeply. He spent 12 to 16 hours a day enveloped in this with these people. Even if you didn't want to say it was, based in anti-Semitism, could it have been an outsider who he pissed off or something? Like, why? No. How? There's no way.
They wouldn't have gotten to his room on the third floor.
Hang out with anybody else. Exactly.
Right. They wouldn't have gotten to his room on the third floor with nobody else seeing anything. And that I would say that even though their religion prevented them from coming forward with information that's not known to be totally factual, if they saw somebody that was not of their community inside their building, they would have came forward and said that.
Absolutely, yeah, because then it's not like somebody that is within, the Orthodox Jewish community that they're accusing.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So some other questions that I had to go back to, like, what did Rabbi Cooper and Hayam talk about? Why was Hayam crying at camp? We can only speculate, but, I think it would be very important to know, at the very least, like, if anybody at the camp had recognized something to say, like, oh, this might have been why Hayam was upset, or they saw something going on. I don't think Rabbi Cooper's ever going to say what that conversation was.
No,
so I think you're unfortunately out of luck on that one, but I think you could hopefully maybe find an answer to what happened at camp.
Yeah.
I think that one's a little bit more open to people coming forward about it, but the other one, if it's a conversation between those two people and one's not here and one's not talking, I think
you're never going to get that information directly from Cooper.
Yeah.
Your best bet is to get information from some other person that observed what had occurred.
Yeah, absolutely.
My question had to do a little bit with an observation having to do with the kid that noticed that his door was open multiple times throughout the night. Was he ever brought in by police, questioned further, and pushed to be like, did you see anybody out of the ordinary that was in the area? Did you see anybody opening your door? Because
apparently all these students were given polygraph tests, and I had not read anything to say that any student failed.
Yeah.
So I'm
But
not
what are
sure.
you asking for questions? Like, you're looking for lies with that. So it's not like in the polygraph, did you murder Chaim Weiss? So it's, I'm not sure what you would gather or what you would gain from the polygraphs when you're just looking for information from people.
Yeah,
if you're trying to rule them out as suspects, I understand it. But to catch somebody in a lie of, withholding information, I don't know how well that would work.
Oh, true.
But
looking back at the autopsy report, like, can you
solidify what type of weapon was used?
Yeah.
Or give more of an inkling one way or the other? Like, was it a stab wound with a knife, or was it like a hack job or a blunt object with a spike on it?
Yeah.
That could have been used.
Definitely. That was one of my questions too. Just confirming what type at the very least. Like, can we get a more specific type? Because then someone might, in the depths of their memory, remember seeing something or noticing something out of place or...
To try and narrow down, student versus
faculty. Yep.
I would think that faculty would have easier access to obtain a weapon and conceal it more so than students would. So if it was a weapon of opportunity that was in a room somewhere, maybe more student, make you lean a little more that way.
Yeah.
Versus if it was an actual weapon, could it have been more, would that make you lean more towards it being a faculty member?
Very true. I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like there are definitely a lot of questions with this one, but that's kind of where mine ended, other than my favorite question of them all. Why is Rabbi Cooper such a sketch?
Yeah, my only other question outside of Rabbi Cooper-ish stuff would be like, did anybody ever come forward saying like Rabbi Cooper in particular was weird around them or anything like that?
Well, in that quote, he said the student that came forward years later about the abuse, he said that the principal let it happen.
So Rabbi Cooper.
So I wonder if that definition of like what his title was is correct. Was he then, just by calling him the principal, not calling him out by name, but
that was Rabbi Cooper back then as well,
insinuating that it was him.
It could have been.
Yeah.
The only other question I was left with is, they have DNA evidence, but where was that DNA evidence found?
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder, like, if maybe it could have been found on his body, like you're thinking, like, say...
What type of DNA was it? Was it hair DNA? Was it sweat DNA?
Well, like,
was
if he
blood?
touched him, you know what I mean? Like, if he had a laceration of the brain, like, that takes, like, a lot of force. Could the person have, like, maybe cut themselves on the weapon, and then that touched Hayam, and they found that within his, just on his body.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if it could be something along those lines,
or if it was sweat DNA from opening the window.
That was the exact next thing I was going to say. Yeah. Or even on his body, just from pulling him off the bed and moving him.
So that's what I would like to know. That the other question: where was the DNA found? What type of DNA was it? And
are they that worried to not test it? Like, how small is it?
Right. Technology is pretty good now, though. Like, how much longer are you going to wait to test it?
Yeah, I agree. That's tough.
Again, something that we've talked about, maybe not on the podcast, but I think the choice should probably go in the parents' hands. You say, okay,
the hands of the family, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, we have this much of a chance to get something out of it. If we wait a few more years, maybe technology will be better, and it could be better. Do you want to do it now, or do you want to wait and let them make that decision?
Yep, absolutely. All right, so with that, if you know anything about who killed Chaim Weiss, please contact the Nassau County Crime Stoppers at 1-800-244-8477. Thank you all so much for tuning in every week. We're so happy to have you here. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review before you go and follow us on our socials.
You can follow us on Instagram at wicked.deeds.podcast and on Twitter at wickeddeeds. Don't forget to visit our website, wickeddeedspodcast.com, to take a look at any photos from this episode and view our source material.
But most importantly, tune in next week for an all-new episode.